Jeff from the BMW DIY Guy. My project today is going to be the CSF High Performance Radiator from Kies Motorsports. I am really psyched to get this in my car. Now, I live in the Pacific Northwest and temperature extremes are generally not something you associate with my area. But I'm also looking forward to potentially getting my car out to the track. So I'm looking at all of the things that I can do to help support all of those elements. And so not only do I get a radiator flush out of this, and with the miles I have on my car, it's a pretty good idea, but I get a new high performance radiator with all of the improvements, their B-tube technology through the whole thing. It's brushed aluminum, it looks really, really cool, and is all polished and neat. So I'm excited to get this in my car. Now remember, everything that you need and specs and links to all the tools and everything else that I've done is in the description below. So just check that out when you need it. Also, click the little alarm bell and subscribe to make sure you get notifications on all my upcoming videos. So let's get out to the car, let's get started and show you how you can do this yourself. So one of the very first things you want to do is you're going to want to pull your intake. So whether you've got a factory intake like I do or an aftermarket intake, it's going to be similar. You have a hose clamp on this end that you're going to release. And then on this end, all you have to do is pull the cover if you've got the factory one. So you're going to want to unclip your sensor, which is to depress the little clip, rock it back, kind of set it out of the way. And there's little metal clips here that hold the top of this on. Now, I will say these clips like to fall off, so be careful, or you may end up with one of these down in the bottom of your belly pan, which is a bit of a drag to go back and get it later, right? So loosen the hose clamp here and then pull your intake off. The intake box can stay, it's out of the way. We need to pull this out of the way so we can pull the fan shroud that's right here. So a couple of things though. I've got a 6MT, so manual transmission. If you have an automatic or DCT transmission, you might have an extra cooler clip that sits right here. I'll talk about it a little bit. There's a screw and it needs to pull up and out of the way, but obviously since I don't have it, I can't show it. But the process is very similar. So I'm going to loosen my hose clamp, pull this up and out of the way. I'll rearrange my camera. We're going to take our hoses and get these out of the way as well. Here. Now these can be a little bit fragile. This front lead one right here, I broke off at where it connects to the primary hose here going into your radiator. I broke it off right here. It snapped one day. It's like the plastic gets brittle. So as you manipulate these, if you've never changed these, be careful or you may end up having to get a part that you didn't plan on. Okay, so let me get this off and then I'll show you how to get the shroud off. All right, so obviously the intake's off. Now what we're going to want to do is I'm going to hand the camera this way or do this by hand so you can see. So first of all, there's a T25 Torx screw right here that's going to need to come out. Now I've got my flashlight shining so you can see. So kind of roll over and look down. I'm going to try not to put shadows in the way. You can see this cable bundle right here, and if you look down you can see one side of the little clip. You have to unplug this. So squeeze it from both sides. Now it's a little hard to show. It's easier to get to. I can get my right hand under my intake pipe right here, under it and around to the clip and pull. But I wanted to show it in place. As you can see, there's a little flange on one side, there's a matching one on the other, so you'd get your hand under there, squeeze and pull the plug up and away. Take the screw out, and then the shroud we're going to work up and away. So let me get that unplugged and the screw out, and then I'll show you how to take the rest of the shroud off. Before I get too much further, I want to show you what I've done. Is you can see the fan shroud is partially out. So I found I was really struggling to get to this. So I could just barely get, as you can see, there's pressure clips on both sides. Obviously it's out, and I'll tell you what I did. It's like I could get a finger on one side or I could get a finger on the other. Now, I also have an oil catch can so if you don't have this, you might have a little extra room right here. I found that I didn't have a lot of room, so I've loosened my oil catch can and pushed it back out of the way a little bit. I took this T25 Torx T25 bolt out, and then I just couldn't seem to quite get to this. So what I realized is there's a fair amount of play in this cable. So the shroud could come up, which is going to lift the plug up to get it to a much more convenient place to get to. Now on this side, there's a little locking clip. Now it's going to be really hard to show, candidly, I'll be honest with you, but right down here, there's a flange that sticks out on the shroud. On the main body of the radiator, there's a little pressure clip that goes downward like this, so you push it in, and you can see where it's locking this flange in place that's right here. Forgive me for the shadows, I'm sorry. Fighting with light today a little bit. there's a flange, and the flange goes down and past that little locking tab. So you press the locking tab in and then pull the shroud up. Now the shroud also has these little clips that clip here and here, so they're going to want to hang on there a little bit as it comes out, so you can pull that out. Once you get this up, the flange is going to come up and hit the pipe here, so you can't just pull it straight up and out. It'll hit this pipe, so we're going to have to angle it out. But once you get it up like that, you get easy access to this clip, press the two sides, bang, it comes right off. So now this is loose, so it's just going to be a matter of pulling this up and out of the way, and I'm going to work it its way out. Now I've also got my intake pipe on here as well, which is my solid intake pipe. So there's a little bit less flexibility here than I normally have, and you've got to get this cowling past it. But it's really not that hard. So I'm just going to work this side up and out and tip it out, because this flange on this side won't let it come straight up and out. All right, so I'll get this off, and then we're going to move to the bottom of the car, take the belly pan off. The other thing I want to stress is that make sure your car is cold. I ran my car to get it to reposition it a little bit and get it up on my quick jacks, which it's up and on right now. But I've given it plenty of time to cool down. Do not burn yourself. Make sure your car is cold, so you don't get yourself with hot radiator fluid here in a little bit. All right, so as you can see, the fan shroud is off. This would be the side that would be facing the motor, facing all the belts, right? So facing inward. So here's where that plug is. Now the one thing is I wanted to point out was this structure right here. So I kept getting hung up on that. Let me move slowly here, look back at the car. Okay, as you can see, it's out, but in my case with my solid intake pipe, I was really struggling because that part of the shroud would hang up here, and I was like, I really don't want to take my intake pipe off. That really seems like unnecessary, something I don't want to do. I don't want to do more work than I need to. Now, I'm doing this in order where the fan shroud comes off first. Now, if you did the order slightly differently and had already drained your radiator, then this next step would be even easier, because I found a way to get it off. I just had to do it a different way, because there's the flange. Let me go back here really quick. Here's the flange I'm talking about right here. This is the flange that locks into place, and I'll show you where the little lock is when I go back to the radiator. But this flange hangs up and hits the top radiator pipe. Move slowly. Okay, so that flange, as it comes up, bang, runs right into here, and it can't swing outward. It doesn't want, you can't get it past this point. You can if the hose is off. Now, doing this in order, you take the shroud off first and then drain your radiator. Now, if you'd already drained your radiator, then this would be a really simple thing to do. I made a little bit of a mess, but it's not a problem. What I did was I pulled, there's a little clip right here. I pulled the clip off here. I pulled the overflow hose. I kept my finger on it because I've got radiator fluid in here still, right? Still have fluid in the car. Then pulled the little clip up here and then back the pipe off, tipped the pipe up to try to keep it from leaking as little as possible, slipped that flange on the shroud past, stuck the hose back on, stuck the overflow hose back on. So I've got a little bit of radiator fluid around. It's not bad. I'm going to clean that up. And we're going to take our belly pan off anyway, so here in a minute or two. So that's really not that much of a problem. So my first recommendation is actually, if you did this in a little bit of reverse order than I'm doing it, drain radiator, then pull the shroud, then you wouldn't have this overflow problem if you couldn't make it past here. I only think it was hung up because of my solid metal pipe, which you can see past the rubber coupling, right? So if you had the rubber one, you could push it back out of the way and it would tip up and out, or mine won't. Okay, so next steps, car's up in the air. Let me touch on really briefly, as I always do. You can do this with 2 jacks and jack stands to just have the front end up. I've got quick jacks. I think they're fantastic, as I always mention. And the other thing that I'm always going to mention is whenever your car is in the air, be really, really careful. Do not do this work with a jack. Don't bet your life on a $50 piece of hydraulics, or it's probably more like $5, right? Always have, if you have one jack, that's fine. Get one side up, put a jack stand underneath, get the other side up, get a jack stand underneath, you can slide underneath the car. Okay, don't bet your life on it. Please don't have an accident there that you're going to regret over trusting a cheap made part. Okay, so the next thing we're going to do is I'm going to get underneath the car. Got to pull the belly pan, which is a dozen or 18 or 20 8mm bolts that hold your belly pan on. Really simple. I'm not going to show that just because you get underneath and you see your belly pan and pull all the 8mm, and then we can get to the bottom of the pump, which is, you can kind of see down in there. Our pump is down in there. So we're going to get down to the bottom of our pump, and then we're going to pull our hose connections on the pump itself, and because that's the low point, and let all of our fluid drain out. All right, so let me get the belly pan off and I'll show you what's next. For orientation, here we are underneath the car, looking at from the nose on. I'm going to roll under here. So you can see the belly pan is off. So we can look up to where the shroud is and the sway bar is. The other thing I did is I took the opportunity to clean my belly pan. So not only did I spill a little bit of antifreeze on it, so I wanted to clean it anyway. Don't like that smell. And you can see I got a little bit of drips from when I pulled the hose off. I'm going to clean that up thoroughly as well. But the other thing is, a clean belly pan may sound a little silly, but I have my belly pan off so much that if it is relatively clean, and it's going to pick up, road grease and gravel and little bits of stuff, but if it's clean, relatively clean, if suddenly I have a leak or something, I'll see it and I'll know what I'm looking at. All right, so the next thing we're looking at is the skid plate right here. So there are more 8mm holding it on. We got to pull the skid plate off. It kind of fits into a tab there in the back. You pull the 3 bolts off the front and the skid plate is off, and then the bottom of the pump, which is right here, will be exposed. So I wanted to show that skid plate coming off before I took it off, but we'll take that and then I'll show you the bottom of the pump. Skid plate's off. This is the bottom of your steering rack here that's covered by that skid plate, and here you can see well lit. This is the bottom of your pump. So where this pump is, you'll see you've got 2 hoses. So you've got one hose here and one hose that's actually a little bit hard to see. It's hard to see. It's easy to see in person, but it's a little hard to see. It comes up above right here. It's a little hard to show on the camera the way the shadows are. So these are the 2 hoses that you're going to pull off, and they've got hose clamps right here. So you'll use a screwdriver or a small socket, and a screwdriver's fine, just to pull this off. Now keep in mind, as soon as you pull this, you're going to get radiator fluid out. So I've got a 5-gallon bucket that I'm going to use as a catch, and I'm going to pull this hose, and I'm going to pull the hose, because the hose is flexible, as you can see. So I'm going to take this and I'm going to pull it off the pump and then down into my bucket. And then the second hose that actually connects kind of right there, you can see if I can get, there it is, right there. You can see I'll do that one next. So I'm going to do one hose at a time. I'll pull this one, drain it in the bucket as soon as I think most of the fluid's out. Then I'll pull the other one and I'll pull the hose down and get all the fluid out. And that's really what you need to do to drain it. And then at that point, we're going to be taking the radiator itself out. So we're going to do that next. Be prepared for the mess. So be quick to pull that hose off, get your bucket in place, and you should be good to go. All right, so that one primary hose is off, as you can see hanging there. Now, the guide and information that I've found says to remove both, and I showed you both earlier. I'm not entirely sure that's necessary, because as I get my hand up there and squeeze that higher hose, it's empty, and I can hear air through this, right? As we still get a little bit draining out, right? So I'm going to give this plenty of time to drain. Now the other thing is, when you pull this off the end of the pump, the pump, which the back of it is right here, as you can see, goes that direction. So it doesn't come straight down. It tends to go out and down. So it's going to hit your steering rack and down. I've got my 5-gallon bucket here. Still got a little bit on the ground. So make sure you're doing this in a place where you can clean up effectively, right? It's not too bad. I got most of it in the bucket. But you know, the other trick that I wanted to show is with this hose. Now I've got a right angle pick right here, as hopefully you can see. This hose is adhered down pretty well. So there's little grooves on the pump itself to hold this hose on, and this hose clamp has been on for a long time, as you can see, you know, how well there's a groove track in it. So what I did was I took my right angle pick in and got it in between the hose and ran it around the seal like this to break, because it really had a seal. I couldn't pull it off. You know, I was trying to twist it and pull on it and it didn't want to move. So I had to get this in and pull it around and then just work it around the inside of this to get it to come loose. And you can tell the moment that that seal starts to break, because you'll start to get fluid that starts to leak through. Okay. So I'm going to make sure that this gets plenty of time to drain out. I know I didn't mention it before, but as you drain this, make sure that you've loosened the cap on your expansion tank up at the top so it's not trying to hold a vacuum and holding any fluid in. Okay, and obviously this would be too late if this was still hot, but as I mentioned earlier, make sure your car is cold or thoroughly cooled down, because you're going to get some of this on your hands and your arm as you pull that hose. So don't make it hot, don't burn yourself, all right? So I'm going to check all of my hoses. I was up above and kind of squeezed the top hose. It sounds like it's just pushing air. I'm going to be flexing these hoses below this guy. So we tip this down again. Do I get any more out? Not really. So I think we're pretty close to drained. So I'm going to make sure that all the rest is drained, and then we'll look to take the radiator out. All right, here we are back at the top of the car. Let's try to take the main hoses off. So here is your top hose, which I'll put partially back into place, and your overflow hose. Now this overflow hose gets really brittle right here. As I mentioned earlier, it's really easy to break. I've done it before by prying up on the hose and it snapped right there. So if you've never changed this, you may be in a place where you might break it. So be really careful. It's kind of a drag. So what I did is you pull up. So I used a hook, pulled up on the little retaining clip, and now it's hard to pull away on it, right, without feeling like I'm putting too much pressure on it. So what I did is I put a screwdriver in between and gently levered it away, and it just came off cleanly. Now, again, be careful so you don't break it. Just take it and set it side up and out of the way. Same thing here. I used my hook, pulled up on the retaining clip, and backed this out. Now, this also was really difficult to get off. If you notice, there's a series of grooves in the pipe. So I very, very gently, because again, the last thing I wanted to do was break anything. Very gently used a screwdriver, a flat bladed screwdriver, and just kind of gently just wedged it back a little bit while pulling, wedged it back a little bit until it came off. All right, so it's out and off, and I'll put that out of the way like that right there. Now, there's two screws you're going to take off. This just doesn't want to stay out of the way for the moment. I've backed one off partially so you can see it. It's right here. It's another T25. It's right here. And then there's another that I have not backed off yet, which is right here. So take both of those screws out, and then you're going to do the same thing to your lower hose, which we can see right there. See down there? Pull the clip up, back the hose off. Now at that point your radiator is loose. You're going to tip it out. There's this cover that's on top, so be careful with this. You're going to tip out towards the motor and up, and it'll come out. All right, so forgive any background noise. Another busy week here in my neighborhood. So as you can see, it's out. You can see the difference between the old one on the right and the CSF on the left. You also have their logo embossed on it as well, which is cool. It came with a plastic cover over the top of all the fins, so none of the fins got beaten up in transport, which is nice, or beaten up in the box, which is really cool. Comes with some additional bolts and the way to secure it a little differently than the OEM, so I'll show that as we put this in. So the next steps are going to be rocking this back into place, putting the new one back into place, and starting to hook it back up. So the new radiator's in, as you can see. So it was a matter of starting with the left side in first, because there's the flange and the drain valve here that you've got to get around, and it wants to hang up on all these pieces. So I started with the left side low, kind of setting that in, and then working the right side in, pushing it out, pushing the hose back and out further back so this could sit out, and then it would fit down and slot it in. And once it was in place, it slots straight in and without any problem at all. Okay, so as you can tell, I also have the hoses back on. I've kept the bleeder tank or the overflow tank hose off so we can get to the bolt right here, and we're going to cover that in just a second. But I've got this upper hose back on with its clip on. I've got the lower hose down there with it, which I'm showing right there, kind of with the shadow. It's back on as well. And actually I hooked that one on as I was putting the radiator in because it made it easier to work with. So that's all set. Now there's some instructions that come along here. I'll show you the picture, which isn't great because initially it didn't make any sense to me either, because there is some new bolts and some spacers that come along with the radiator. And initially it didn't make a lot of sense to me on how it works, but now it does. So here's your mount and the flange for the new radiator. When you put the cover on, because the cover is held in by the same bolt, the cover is going to sit out a little bit further. So now you're going to have an air gap in between. So you're going to use the new bolts for that, and they're not a Torx bolt, they're a socket head. So what you'll do is you'll get this into place. You'll take the cover, right, because there's the hole in the cover right there. What I'm going to do is I'm going to take it, I'm going to put the bolt through and then put the spacer on and then fit it into place. And then that way your cover will be into place. So that makes sense. Here's the picture again. So there's the flange up against the mount right there, which was where the bolt was before. And here's actually your cover, and that is what wasn't clear to me, is that's actually the cover, which is why you've got that spacer in between. So, and the new bolt. So I'm going to bolt that in, put the cover on, put the new bolts on, and then we're going to talk about putting the fan shroud back in. All right, so you can see the cover's on, the new bolts are in place, and so I've also taken this hose back off because I wanted to show a couple of pointers. Plus, getting the fan shroud back in, it's going to be better to have that pipe off. So look at this. One thing I wanted to point out here, and I'll try to get shadows out of the way. So right here, so instead of that little pressure plastic clip that you'd press down, remember, to get the fan shroud out, there's now this hanger with a bolt, so that you'll screw down to secure it in place. So that's one difference there when you put the fan shroud back on. My upper hose is off, but my lower hose down there, as you can see, with the shadow, is on and good to go. I've also taken the bolt out here in prep to hang the fan shroud back on. And so this is also tightened down as well. One thing to keep in mind when you put these in, these are metal into plastic. So be really careful when you do that. Don't strip them. So just snug, right? That half turn too many will snap them straight out. So what you're going to want to do is you're going to want to take the fan shroud, do that same thing where tip it the left side in and kind of fit it down and in, secure it in place, make sure that it's hanging off that clip on that side, secured here on the left side, and then plugged back in. So I'm going to take it and get it kind of half in, and then I'll plug this back in and slide it down into place. So once that's into place, we can also secure the hose back underneath, and we're really close to bolting it all back up and then flushing it and getting new fluid in, which is actually why I've already got that all plugged in and ready to go. So I'll explain about that when we get there, but let's finish putting it all back together first. So putting everything back together here before we pressurize and refill, let's just make sure that we've got everything reconnected. So we've got that hose that goes over to the overflow tank. We've got this back on and where it should be. It's a little tight. Let's get that rearranged. Where I'm going to throw the intake back on. When you go underneath, we're going to install the skid plate and the belly pan. Also make sure that you plug the hose that came off that bottom hose off the water pump back on. It should slot right back on really well. Also notice that there's two white hash marks on that hose, and that hose clamp goes right in between the two. Crank it down tight. I've already got that done, so I'm going to put the skid plate and the belly pan back on, put the intake back on, and then we're going to walk through this process. And I've got my air compressor, and this is, I really wanted to do it right. So this tool wasn't all that expensive, and it will be linked in the description. So this is how to do it right and to pressure bleed and get all the air out of the system. It creates a vacuum and then sucks your radiator fluid back in. And the price wasn't really that bad. So, all right, so I'm going to put my air intake back on, belly pan, skid plate, and all that, and then we're going to charge the system. Let's walk through what this cool little tool did. Okay, so first of all, I've got a small pancake air compressor capable of 90 pounds. So I've plugged this all in. I used the 40 millimeter neck, and then this assembly fits, you put the neck onto this assembly and then this assembly into the bottle. I've hooked up, the blue line is my air compressor. This is a Venturi connection, and I've got a little bit of an overfill here, and this was distilled water. So I don't have a nice filler bucket, so I used one of my clean buckets, and I put 50% BMW coolant, 50% distilled water into the bucket. Never let the fill end of the line there suck in air, so always make sure that that's okay as you fill it. So I've already filled, but I wanted to walk through the process because it's actually kind of loud, so I didn't want to make you have to sit through that. But this is a cool tool. So you start with all of these lines closed, everything's closed. You power up and you attach your air compressor system. You then open your air compressor line, you open this intermediate line, and it pressurizes the system. And basically what it does is it creates a vacuum. The interesting thing is you can watch your radiator hoses like over here, you watch them compress and flatten. So you watch your gauge. Once your gauge stabilizes, in my case, and how much pressure you get depends on your air compressor and your setup. I had 24 negative pounds and it stabilized there. So then I closed the intermediate, this intermediate feed right here, and let it sit for a few minutes to make sure I didn't have any leaks. After a couple of minutes, it was still sitting at 24. And then I very slowly opened this line, which is the feed line out of the bucket, and it sucks it all through. You can see I've got fluid now in my overflow reservoir. It should have sucked all the air out. I put my distilled water bucket here because it's possible when you first do this, when you first charge the system, to get a little bit of fluid out of the system. So I put this here so I wouldn't blow fluid all over my car or anything similar. But this is a cool tool. Looks a little complex, really not that hard once you try it. And actually it works really, really sophisticated if you have an air compressor. Now the other thing I'm going to do is, once I get cleaned up here, I'm going to show you the way that in the car you can get it to flush your fluid. You're going to need a trickle charger because it takes about 12 to 15 minutes, but it's something that you can do as well. So if you didn't have an air compressor or this tool, though an air compressor is not all that expensive, you can get one for about $100 or $80. You can get them used for even less. This was like $50. This was a cool way of doing it. I don't know if I'll ever use this tool again, but it was cool this time, and I very well may. You never know about other cars, right? So I'm going to get finished getting all this cleaned up and buttoned up, and then I'll show you how the in-the-car way to get your fuel pump, or get your water pump to cycle. Basically, it cycles your water pump for 12 minutes and gets all of the fluid around and through as well. So I'll show you that next. Really quickly, I've got the trickle charger on because, like I said, I don't want to flatten my battery when I run this for 12 minutes. I've got the lid back on. I'm a little high in my reservoir. I'm a little bit above the maximum mark right now, but I want it to cycle all the way through before it's warm to make sure if there is any air, that level will go down. Worst case scenario, once the cycle is done, I will just use a syringe and suck out the extra. So let's get into the car and take a look at what we need to do. All right, so we're in the car. So what you do is you turn your ignition on, you turn your low beams on, which again is why you got to support your battery. You turn your heat on as high as it will go and the fan on the lowest setting. Then hold down the accelerator pedal for 10 seconds. And then you'll hear the pump fire up. I don't know if your camera's catching it, but I can hear it running, and I can hear air up in the reservoir going along, and the reservoir level's already gone down a little bit from it's being too high, so I'm glad I didn't take any extra out. So this will run for about 12 minutes. I'm not going to make you sit through it all. I'm going to take this time to clean up and put my tools away, and we'll come back when it's done. All right about at time. What's kind of nice is that pressure tool did exactly what it was supposed to do. And when it hits zero, your system is full. So even though my reservoir was a little high, the max line is right here and it was up in here. When I went and go ahead and did the coolant flush, which is just wrapping up now, you notice it's right exactly where it was supposed to be. So it made some interesting gurgling noises and as it's moving stuff around, but clearly it did what it's supposed to do. So car's down on the ground, tools are put away. Everything's cleaned up here. I'm just going to let it finish up this process and wrap up with my tools. All right, all my tools are put away and the car's cleaned up. Took it for a quick drive around the neighborhood to make sure that there weren't any leaks, and it looks fantastic. Thank you to Kies Motorsports for being such a fantastic partner on this project, and to CSF for making an incredible upgrade that I've got in my car as I look forward to potentially taking my car out for some track days. If I do that, I'll document it, don't worry. Again, make sure to click subscribe and the little alarm bell, and check out in the video description. You're going to get all the tools and links to everything that I've used today. And I look forward to seeing you on my next project.